Thank you. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen full?
Yep, that's all good.
Brilliant. Okay. Yeah, we're being recorded, which is in some ways a shame because, like Martin, I could definitely do the indiscreet version of this talk, but if we were doing this face to face, we could go down to the Meadow Park afterwards for some pints. Never mind, maybe another year. So I'm now a lecturer in sociology. I'm the Faculty of Social Sciences at Stirling. And this presentation is really sort of my experiences of doing interdisciplinary research. I finished my PhD in 2016. So yeah, about 5 years ago now. And I've put sort of becoming an interdisciplinary researcher in brackets by mistake. And as you could sort of tell from Wendy's introduction, so my interests are aging, home, sociology of health and illness. So I've done sort of bits and pieces. And part of this is because, while you might imagine yourself as a PhD student or early career researcher, sort of as a sapling growing towards the light of your chosen discipline and your chosen career, in my experience, and I think in the experience of many others, you're more like a leaf that's being blown around in the wind because you're just going where the opportunities take you and trying to position yourself for whichever opportunities are coming up at the time. So as an early career contract researcher, you often going where the jobs are, even if they're not in your discipline. So even, not necessarily by design, but by accident, you become interdisciplinary, even if it wasn't your original intention. And one of the challenges of this, and this has already come up, is the imposter syndrome that you might feel of working in different disciplines. There was definitely a time when I felt like I was sort of a jack of many disciplines and master of none. So I can come back to that in the questions if there are any at the end. And it can be a challenge to sort of position yourself as having interdisciplinary skills while not losing sight of your own central discipline. So it's getting this balance right between, I guess, knowing where your natural home is and not wanting to lose sight of that, while also picking up these skills from working across different disciplines as you go along, and trying to make, it's kind of like what Martin has said, you're trying to market that as a benefit, as an asset, rather than feeling like an imposter because of that. And so I've outlined some of the challenges, but during the course of this presentation, I want to offer some potential solutions as well. So how to make the most of what can feel like an uncontrollable environment when you're going where the jobs are and trying to position yourself in different ways, and how to survive being a contract researcher in unfamiliar environments, and how to make the most of interdisciplinary experience. So I can speak about my own experience of all this. So I joined the University of Stirling as a lecturer in sociology in August 2016. I always find it interesting how people ended up doing what they were doing. And I think if I was a student, I'd think, oh, she's a lecturer in sociology. That means that she always wanted to be a lecturer in sociology. And it's actually relatively recently that I felt comfortable saying, I am a sociologist. In fact, yeah, being appointed as a lecturer in sociology gives you a real boost and things, well, I guess I'd better be that now, whereas before you might feel a bit uncertain about it. I have an interdisciplinary background, again, not really by design, but my first degree was in history. It was a subject that I enjoyed most at school, so that's why I chose that. Then I had a 2-year gap while I did some work. Always, my reason for doing a master's degree initially was more because I wanted to spend some time abroad, and I thought that was quite a safe and good way to do that. So 1.5 years after doing my BA, I thought, oh, I'll start thinking where I can do history in different universities around the world. And I forget which university it was, somewhere in America, I think. They had an A to Z listing of all the subjects that they did. And I was scrolling down to H because I thought I'd do history because that's what I did for my previous degree. And then I saw that you could do folklore. So I thought, oh, wow, you can do a master's degree in folklore. That sounds fun. So I ended up doing that in Newfoundland, Canada, which is brilliant. And then I liked doing that, introduced me to qualitative research, which I knew that I liked doing. But it was another 5 years before I decided to do a PhD. And that was in sociological studies at the University of Sheffield. Both of my supervisors well, 2 out of my 3 supervisors are probably describing themselves as social anthropologists. So there's been some interdisciplinarity in that. I did my PhD part-time, and that was because I hadn't really thought too much about doing it. And I already had a job working as an administrator at the University of Sheffield. And at the time, Sheffield had this scheme where, in fact, they might still have it, if you were employed at the university and wanted to do a PhD, you could apply as a staff candidate, which is where you didn't get a stipend, but you didn't pay fees. So you were effectively a part-time student, but without paying fees. And that worked really well for me. So effectively, it took me twice as long to get my PhD as my full-time peers, but I managed to get research experience and the publications that went along with that along the way. So I was able to get a lectureship after my PhD rather than doing more postdocs, because I'd effectively sort of done the postdoc experience while I was doing my PhD. So whatever works for you, but it works quite well for me. And I certainly found that I was probably a more disciplined student doing it part-time than I would have been full-time, I think. So my PhD was looking at the experiences of becoming at home or not in an older people's residential home. And that was in the sociological studies department. Being within a university environments gave me probably an advantage in getting some of the research posts that came up at Sheffield. So I was quite lucky in that respect. So during the 6 years of doing my PhD, I had a whole range of other posts, some administrative, and then later on more research. So the first one I had was in the academic unit of supportive care, and this project was all about researching the experiences of bereaved carers who had received the services of healthcare assistance in the home while they were caring for a loved one who was dying of cancer, usually cancer. And so that was qualitative interviews, analysis. I was the only, I probably wouldn't have called myself a sociologist at the time, but certainly the only person doing a degree in sociology. The rest were clinicians, public health specialists. I was very much learning my trade, but it was great experience. Managed to get some contract interviews at the Social Policy Research Unit at the University of York, interviewing adults of South Asian origin who had inflammatory bowel disease. Had no background in this whatsoever, but again, it was applying the methodological expertise I was slowly developing, so qualitative interviewing. And from then I got research work in the School of Health and Related Research at Sheffield, specifically in the public health section. So I worked on a project, alcohol policy interventions in Scotland and England. Actually, that was with the University of Stirling. I didn't know anything about the University of Stirling at the time, but that's when I first started encountering researchers from there. From there, I managed to get onto another research project. I was co-I on this one, which was really good. And I was very grateful to my then line manager for making me co-I rather than just a research associate. That was researching drinking cultures in Britain. That came to an end. So I got all of this good experience, which was really, really great, but all of these were on very, very short-term, fixed-term contracts. So I was always scrabbling around for the next thing. And then I got a job in the information science department when the public health contract came to an end. This was a fascinating project. I could say a lot about this. Very interdisciplinary, how trust, empathy, and sharing work in online environments in extreme circumstances. So that was across, I think it was 6 different universities, all from different disciplines: computer scientists, information scientists, sociologists, epidemiologists, ethicists, yeah, all sorts. Very interdisciplinary. So all of this was really great experience, but I was doing all of this while also doing my PhD in a sociological studies department. And I sort of had this identity crisis coming towards the end of my PhD, thinking, what do I do? I felt like I was being sort of pulled in different directions and didn't have a clear sense of what I was. I remember having a conversation with friends at the time that they were saying, well, you did a degree in folklore. Does that mean you're a folklorist now? And I said, well, no, because that was 2 years and I've moved on from that, but I don't really feel like I'm a sociologist yet either. So it takes a while to feel comfortable having which certainly did for me, having the confidence to say, I am a whatever. And you might not, but it was, I definitely felt the lack of that until I felt comfortable calling myself a sociologist. There is some really interesting and, to me, useful literature out there on kind of having an identity crisis and working across different disciplines, particularly as a contract researcher. And Jackie Good has written about kind of having multiple research identities or conflicting research identities when you're going from contract to contract. And she writes about having this inherent tension between a continuous sense of the research self and institutional and substantive discontinuities between projects, research topics, and research sites. So that's another good point. You might be working not only between different disciplines, but different institutions which have different ways of working. And she says, as this pattern continues, one has to construct one's codified self as represented by the CV as having some demonstrable relevance for the next post. And this is something else that Martin mentioned, and I would completely support. So you have to kind of market yourself in a particular way, depending on what jobs are coming up. So by the time I finished my PhD, I had a PhD in kind of aging research. I also had sociology of health and illness, material culture studies, because that was a methodology I used in my PhD. As it happens, the first job, the lectureship that came up at Stirling, they were looking for a lecturer in aging. So that's how I pitched myself. If they'd been looking for a lecturer in sociology of health and illness, I would have talked up all the work I did around bereaved carers and healthcare assistants and the alcohol research stuff that I'd done. So it is kind of having this idea of how you want to pitch yourself. So there are some things that you can do to help yourself as you are working out how to navigate these different disciplines. So you can ask your principal investigator if you're working on a project, or your supervisors, colleagues in other disciplines, for pointers to key texts that helps you to familiarize yourself with literature and key paradigms in different disciplines. It's often, if you're working on an interdisciplinary project as a contract researcher, the PI will have already got the money and written the grants based on interdisciplinary research. And then it's kind of up to the early career researcher to operationalize that at the ground level, at the kind of the coalface, I guess. And that can be really challenging. So ask to read the original grant application, talk to the principal investigator for, how they envisioned interdisciplinarity working in that project. And yes, imposter syndrome does come up. So try to have confidence in yourself as an expert in your discipline, which is easier said than done. Something which I wish that I had done, I'll just scoot back. So this project I worked on, a new approach to measuring drinking cultures in Britain. I had this nagging sense at the time that I thought, can you really measure drinking cultures? Didn't really fit with my epistemological position or my approach as a qualitative sociologist. But I let it go because I didn't really have the confidence to challenge that. I wasn't the PI, although I was the co-I. So I could have challenged it, I didn't. It was always niggling away at me. And then a couple of years after we did the research, my line manager said, I'm not really sure you can measure drinking cultures. I thought, I knew it, I should have said something. So that's always going to be irritating me on my CV, that was called something that I don't really think you can measure a culture. I would recommend this paper by Farida Tilbury, Piggy in the Middle, The Liminality of the Contract Researcher in Funded Collaborative Research. I think she probably gets as close as you can get to being indiscreet in a published journal without completely ruining your chances of getting employed somewhere else afterwards. She gives a kind of really good warts and all, no holds barred account of working across different disciplines and some tips on how to navigate that. So just to start to wind up then, some of the tips, how can you make all this interdisciplinarity work in your favor? Think about what you want, and if you're applying for jobs, apply some post hoc coherence to your CV. So make it seem like this was the plan. Sarah Louise Wheeler has this really good paper, Constructing a Sociological Biography, and she's talking about what could be quite a mundane activity of starting a new job and creating your web profile. And actually she talks about how it was really difficult and very time consuming to do that, working across different institutions and different disciplines and trying to construct this coherence about this is who I am as a researcher, this is my expertise. So look at your PhD, look at your CV and think, if you feel like you've got all this experience that's all over the shop, look to see what the commonalities are in there. So I ended my PhD and having done all this contract research thinking I've got all this disparate experience. Actually, when I looked at it, when I was starting to apply for lectureships, qualitative research, that was a continuity. Health and illness and aging, that was another continuity. So when you're pitching yourself, you can talk about the things that do seem more coherent. And you can also be more honest about the things that are, I did this for the opportunity. And then you can talk about identifying transferable skills. So when I was applying for the lectureship in aging at Stirling, I said at my interview, I don't have any publications in the field of aging. I do have publications in public health epidemiological journals that came from my research associate experience. So I said, I've demonstrated that I can publish in good journals. So that is my aim for the papers that will come out of my PhD that I will pitch to, that will submit to aging journals. So don't worry too much if you don't have all the expertise and experience in the discipline that you want to concentrate in. You can talk about transferring some of those skills. Think about what think critically about what you have learned from working or studying across different disciplines. Oops, sorry, I'm over time. And just a final piece of advice, if possible, try and get a mentor. I'm not sure where Stirling is in a mentoring program. I think Rachel Nunn was thinking about setting one up, so I don't know if anybody has more information on that. What worked for me, Sheffield had a really good mentoring program where they paired you up with a mentor who was a senior colleague out with your discipline. So I was doing a PhD in sociology, I was working in public health at the time, and they paired me up with a professor in education because they could give me a bit of more objective advice that wasn't particularly tied to what they thought I should be doing, which is based on kind of their interests as well as just mine. So yeah, if possible, get yourself a mentor, and I'm happy for anybody to follow up with me afterwards, so just send me an email. And I'm going to stop sharing now because I am slightly over.
That's great, Melanie. Thank you so much. We've got time from 3 till 3:30 for questions. So we're just going to get straight on to the next presentation, which is Dr. Jen Dickey, who's an interdisciplinary researcher whose work focuses on the socio-environmental interactions of the energy landscape. So Jen, if you want to share your screen just now, and I'll let you take over from here.
Thank you very much. There we go. Can everyone see the full screen?
Yep, all good.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thanks for that lovely introduction, Wendy. You saved me some time talking about myself. My talk, I guess, is going to be slightly different from the others in that I'm going to focus firstly on a bit of background about myself and do a quick tour of my career. But really what I want to talk about is sort of my personal experiences beyond PhD, beyond postdoc, when I'm kind of going it alone, working in interdisciplinary work, and how I've found it trying to reach out to different disciplines. So I'm going to focus on two aspects of my research. High altitude biogas research and my interactions with an anthropologist, and then shale gas and subsurface technologies working with geoscientists. And I'll try and tell you a little bit about my experiences, challenges, and kind of lessons learned, I guess. So firstly, geography. Okay, so it's argued that it's an inherently interdisciplinary subject anyway. Even the RGS, the Royal Geographical Society, talk about it being unique in bridging the social sciences and natural sciences. And I guess the way geography does that is through this context of place. So the relationships between people and the environments and how they interact. And I think if you look at all the sub-disciplines in geography, you know, it does sort of reinforce that. You've got urban geographers, rural geographers, cultural geographers. Then you've got some more geomorphologists, biogeographers that might be more in the physical kind of geography side of it. But actually, I would argue that we're making it's quite tough at the beginning, and when you start out in geography, to really think in an interdisciplinary way. And that's because when we teach geography, when we learn about geography at school, and if you go on to university, we still teach it in a very siloed format. So you still have to go down the physical geography track or the human geography track. So the sort of the natural sciences versus the social sciences. And it's really quite hard to kind of bridge those two different disciplines together. And certainly for me, my experience, it was really challenging. And I have to admit, for the first kind of half of my career, I suppose, I really didn't think beyond my own silo. But I wanted to share with you that it is actually possible to move beyond silos and think about how you can work in an interdisciplinary fashion. So this is just a kind of diagram of my career, very simplified, but I started out very much in the natural science realm. I actually did my undergraduate degree here many moons ago in environmental science. So it's mostly physical geography. So, you know, you study earthquakes and glaciers and soil and things like that. And there were no social science modules whatsoever in that particular degree programme. And I followed that through to doing a PhD in physical geography. But this time I went to a different university. I went to Leicester Uni, and it was actually a geography department that I moved into. And I would say that this was a real sort of eye-opener for me, because the way that Leicester worked was you had, as I say, the human geographers, the physical geographers, and you also had the geographical information science folk. So they're people that are interested in sort of spatial analysis and mapping and things like that. But back to my PhD, it was very physical geography. It was dryland geomorphology. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically the patterns and processes of the landscape. Basically, I sampled soil for 3.5 years and was stuck in a lab for a long time. Although it was in a nice location, I got to go to South Africa for that. But you know, the project was about soil erosion, but there was no integration of sort of stakeholders or anything. I didn't speak to people. I was very much in my own little silo of physical geography. But nearing the end of my PhD, I started to pay more attention to what else was going on in the department. So I started attending some of the human geography talks and learning a little bit more about what people actually did, and similarly with GIS. And that's when I really realised the amazing benefits and how strongly, how can I say this, the benefits of bringing these different disciplines into my project, how great that would have been to really add value to my work. So if I had gone out and spoken to farmers and other stakeholders, I could have really done a much better job of my PhD. But by this point, by this realisation, it was too far gone, and it really was a very dry, literally, no pun intended, PhD. But I was incredibly lucky because the spark had kind of gone by this point. Physical geography realised that there's not a much kind of call for dryland geomorphology in Leicester or in the UK, no jobs out there, but a job came up in the department with the GIS team. And lucky for me, they were convinced about my argument about why they should give the job to me. But basically, they had won a lot of money to build a virtual reality theatre in the department. And they were interested in spatial literacy. What they were looking for was someone with a physical geography background to come in and work as part of the team to really explore how the GIS team could apply these really novel visualization tools and methodologies that they were producing in the discipline of physical geography. So it was brilliant, and I learned so much. And they were very open to sort of training me up in these new skill sets. But actually, when we tried to then take it back to the physical geographers and say, look at these new, amazing, novel techniques, they weren't actually that interested. But lucky for me, the human geographers in the department had been paying attention and had recognised the value of spatial analysis and novel visualisation techniques in their work and their research. And a job came up in the department, and again I applied for it, but this time in a completely different discipline. It was being led by the human geographers, and the project was on climate change resilience in rural communities in England. And just as some of the others have said, I kind of refocused my CV. I talked about all these skills that I'd learned. I have the natural science background, the understanding of the drivers of climate change, and I also had these visualization and GIS skills that at the time it was more unusual to have these sort of combined skill sets, and why I would be the perfect PDRA for this human geography position. And luckily they were convinced and they brought me on board. And this is where imposter syndrome really kicked in, I guess, for me, because weirdly in the department, whichever research group your boss was in, that was the one that you were in. So I had literally moved across all three of the big research groups: physical geography, then I was a GIS person, and then suddenly I was being told that I was a human geographer. And the physical geographers were like, oh, you've moved to the dark side. I had had no formal training in human geography. I didn't know how to design questionnaires. I didn't know how to conduct any kind of social science research, but they were very open to training me up, and I really did learn on the job here. So I think listening to Melanie and is it Martin? You know, it is possible to move between disciplines, and if you're in a supportive environment, it's really helpful. So before I knew it, not only was I making things in VR theatres, I was bringing in my natural science background, but I was out in the field conducting interviews in rural England, and it was one of the most sort of fascinating experiences of my career, and it really made me think that this is what I wanted to do for the rest of my career. And interestingly, this is where my interest in energy really stemmed from. So one of the communities that I was working in was being heavily impacted by a new wind farm development, and I really got into all the ins and outs and the conflict, and it really made me think, energy geography, this sounds interesting. And that sort of set me off in a trajectory. And because I'd built up a little bit of experience then working with social scientists, I was then able to apply for another PDRA job in the department, this time looking at biogas in rural India. And this was a fantastic project because it went beyond what I'd already been working with in terms of disciplines. It went beyond human geography, physical geography, etc. It was bringing in engineers, it was bringing in people with an education background, and also business and enterprise. So I really got a taste for working as an interdisciplinary scientist then, but I did feel uncomfortable. And as Melanie says, you know, I did have a kind of identity crisis, like, who am I? But then in the process of applying for jobs, I realized that actually you can be anything you want to be. And I decided that rather than getting stuck being pigeonholed as a kind of a physical geographer, a human geographer, social scientist, if I just said I was an energy geographer and I worked in interdisciplinary ways, then that was acceptable. And that's when the ideal job came up for me at Stirling University. So then it's full circle. And things had changed since I'd been an undergrad, and it had started a new degree programme in environmental geography. So this was the perfect home for me because it's joining the physical and the human together. And I guess the next part of my career is the bit that I want to talk to you about, because I think sometimes you get very focused on the PhD part and then postdocs, but sometimes it's good to see what happens after that. So I'm going to talk to you about some of my experiences now, trying to find my own research identity rather than just falling into these PDRA posts that happened at Leicester. This is when I actively sought out research networks and collaborators. But just quickly to tell you a little bit about energy geography then, so that you have a bit of an understanding of what that is. There are two key strands to my work. public perceptions in reaction to subsurface energy technologies. So that's UK-based work. And then energy access and vulnerability. So this is work that I do in the Global South, so India and Nepal. And this work comes together in this sort of umbrella of energy justice. So what I was going to say here is that in my experience, you learn new skills in the different discipline areas, and you think, oh, well, I'm not doing anything new and exciting. But as you go across and sort of transcend these different disciplines and bring what you learn into these new disciplines, then actually the application of what can be quite common and standard in one becomes a bit more innovative in another. So I do lots of stuff, but perhaps the most exciting is the joining the participatory research with GIS mapping and integrating that aspect of it. I'm just aware of the time. So let me just very briefly tell you about my biogas research. So this work is based in India and Nepal. I've been doing it for quite a long time now, and it is very interdisciplinary already. But as I wanted to develop my own research agenda, I was looking at toilet-linked biogas research. And this is where sort of social and cultural taboos started to become really important. And I realised there was a huge gap in my interdisciplinary team, and I needed an anthropologist. Now, when you think about working with new people, it's very common to sit down and think about the different epistemological frameworks that you work in and try and match them up. And I think that is really important. But I guess my key piece of learning from working with an anthropologist was that it's so important to actually experience research through the eyes of another discipline before you get really involved with them. And that's because it's the other stuff it's also very important. So like for me, it's really important to have an itinerary on fieldwork and make sure you know what you're doing. Working with an anthropologist, anything goes. And so just to skip on, this is the cheese factory where there's a biogas unit there where we're going to check it out for a future research proposal. It was halfway up a mountain. I knew that. It was high altitude research. I presumed there'd be a road there. Of course, there was no road, so we had to trek up half a mountain. Then I realised that anthropologists don't plan fieldwork by seasonality, weather, anything like that. It's about cultural events. And they also look for full moons. And if there's a full moon, watch out, because it's likely that if you're halfway up a mountain anyway and there's a pilgrimage happening, you're going to join it. So that's how, as an energy geographer, I ended up on a pilgrimage to a sacred lake in Nepal. But it was an amazing experience, and it's really helped us develop a research proposal together. I'm massively over time, haven't I? I'm going to skip to my last slide, Wendy. Okay.
I mean, we've got the time for the questions at the end. So if you want to take like an extra 5 minutes, then that's fine. We have got the time. I don't want to cut your presentation short. So yeah, I mean, you've got a little bit extra, so you can keep going.
Okay, thank you. So I will speed up this part because this is the work that I do with geoscientists, and so this is a very controversial subject area: shale gas and fracking. And just to talk to you about some of the challenges working again with a very different discipline. I think the key things for me that I learned in this project was that the research goals and assumptions that the different disciplines had really influenced how we work together. And that's because the geoscientists tended to be funded by industry. So they were trying to help the shale gas landscape develop. Whereas we as social scientists were trying to understand how the public felt about a particular topic. And this caused real friction when we were actually trying to do our research, because when you're working with the public on a controversial subject area, they're very interested in who's funding the research. Trust building is really important. And so we were having to tell people that we were working with people that are funded by industry, and therefore suspicions were raised about what we were doing. And I think also amongst the team, there was some suspicion about what the social scientists were trying to do on this project, and how sort of although we were trying to be unbiased, there's a huge amount of negative press around fracking, and the public are very opposed to it. And that's not the answers that some of the geoscientists wanted to hear. And I think it's a really interesting issue, because if I just get to my last slide and talk about what the key findings of working with the geoscientists were, was that I think the project PIs and co-Is had talked through some of these epistemological disagreements and how we were going to tackle things like communication and language challenges, but it never filtered down to the whole team. So it's really important when you're working in interdisciplinary teams that you do involve everyone, whether there's postdocs, PhD students, so that everyone's on the same level. And I think I'm just going to end with my final point here on publications, because out of all my experiences and learning, the key thing to think about is, if you're working with different disciplines, how do they publish? Where do they publish? What are the standards for authorship? And what I found out was, natural scientists, it's very important to be the first or the last author. In social science, it's the first and second author. In other disciplines, it's alphabetical. And this can cause massive conflict within an interdisciplinary team when you're publishing together. So just think about some of these challenges when you are sort of getting involved with different disciplines. But overall, although it can be a frustrating experience, it's highly rewarding.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was great. Some really funny things there. Do you want me to stop sharing your screen? Or
I think I've done it now.
Oh, you got it. Perfect.
Sorry for overrunning, everyone.
It's fine. We've got the half an hour at the end, so we'll still have plenty of time for questions. So if people do have questions for Jen, then just make a note of them, and we can do that from 3 o'clock onwards. But I'm going to hand over to Dr. Isla Hodgson now, who's primarily interested in the human dimensions of conservation conflicts and studies their social and political aspects, relationships, power dynamics, and governance. So handing over to you, Isla, just now.
Yeah, hello, thank you. Sorry, I'm just figuring out, I did this earlier, but the bar at the top of my screen is now covering the bit where I can get onto full screen. There we go, navigated it. It's fine. But yes, hello everyone. Thank you for introducing me. As Wendy mentioned, I am a conservation scientist, but I do kind of class myself as a conservation, social and political scientist now, which even now feels good, even though I've been in it for about 5 years. I still kind of consider myself still an ecologist, but we'll kind of get onto that a little bit later on. But through everybody's talk so far, I've been nodding my head so hard because it's so nice to hear how similar other people's experiences are of being an interdisciplinary researcher. So a lot of the themes in my talk will be very similar to what Jen said, to what the other speakers have said as well, in that I kind of came to this almost by accident or completely by accident. And I've definitely learned a lot about being an interdisciplinary researcher kind of on the job. So just to kind of give a really brief overview of where I am now, I specialise in something called conservation conflicts and their management, which we'll learn a little bit on my talk. But essentially, it's kind of the conflicts that occur broadly between the interests of conservation and other often competing interests, so things like agriculture or fisheries, things like that. And basically, I kind of study human-human interactions in conservation. So how different groups of humans interact with each other, why these conflicts happen. But I actually didn't always set out to study this. And it was kind of very much by accident that I stumbled across this problem. So when I first started at university, I was actually a marine scientist. So I was very much situated in ecology, in marine ecology. I learned to scuba dive. I spent a lot of time, as much time underneath the water as I did above it. This is me in my sort of like prime ecologist days, binoculars around the neck, wellies there, a little bit of dirt on my knees. Quite alarmingly, I'm not using the binoculars to look anywhere. So maybe me not going into ecology as a career was the right move there. But yeah, so I did a undergraduate degree in marine science, and then I did a master's in marine science. And I specialized in the habitat use of minke whales. For those of you who don't know what a minke whale is, it's a very, very cute, in my personal opinion, species of whale that is native to UK waters. That's them in the bottom corner there. And I considered this master's thesis as what I would call like very hardcore ecology. So it was habitat modeling, it was using geographical information systems, very, very much a single discipline. And then I kind of got to the end of my degrees. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew I was still passionate about zoology and marine science. But to be quite honest, I wasn't very good at modeling. My brain just wasn't in it. My brain just doesn't fit, just doesn't work that way. And so kind of like in the meantime, while I was deciding what I want to do, I kind of went out to South Africa and trained as a safari guide. I also did a wildlife veterinary course. And it was while I was there that I came across these things called human wildlife conflict, which you might have heard about. It's a huge buzzword in conservation. And the official definition is situations that occur when humans and wildlife interact, and when that interaction, or when humans or wildlife have an adverse impact on one another. And in Africa, cases of human wildlife conflict. The one that I was most familiar with, I used to work on a cheetah rehabilitation centre. And there were lots of conflicts there where the cheetah would wander onto a farmer's land, see a tasty goat or a tasty sheep and take that for his dinner. And the farmers would retaliate by setting snares for the cheetahs. And we'd often find parents caught in these snares, or parents that had been shot, and then we'd rescue the orphaned cubs, or we'd rescue the injured adults. And while I was there, I found a lot of the work that I was actually doing was working with the local community. So trying to figure out why they were doing this, and trying to figure out how we could work with them to stop this problem. And that's kind of a very common approach to human wildlife conflict, is to work with the people that are shooting the animal, or they have a land use that's damaging to conservation, and trying to work with them to alleviate that negative impact, or to figure out an alternative for that damaging land use. And I got really into that, and I thought that was really cool. So when I came back to the UK, I was involved in a research project that studied the interaction between seals and salmon fishermen on the east coast of Scotland, on a place called the Ithen Estuary, which is just north of Aberdeenshire. And again, you have that very classic problem. You had a huge population of grey seals. You can see them there at the bottom, all across the beach. And the salmon fishermen on the estuary believed that seals were taking so much salmon that they were making the salmon stocks go down. So again, I took a very sort of I had my ecologist hat on. I took a very sort of like animal behavior, animal ecology approach to solving this problem. So I researched seal behavior, and I did scat analysis, which, for those of you who don't know what that is, that's basically just looking through poop, essentially, and trying to figure out what it was that the seals were eating. And at the end of this project, like I did in South Africa, I went back to the primary stakeholders, if you like, and told them what my research was showing. And my research actually showed that the salmon stocks in the estuary were going up. There was very, very little evidence that seals were actually taking the salmon. And one thing I didn't mention about the South African case study is that although we worked extensively with the local communities there, and we brought in something called an Anatolian guard dog scheme, which is very similar to what we were doing with the seals, which was trying to figure out how we can alleviate that negative human wildlife impact. The local communities didn't stop setting snares for the cheetahs. Same thing with the seals. Even though we communicated the findings of our research to the anglers on the Ithen Estuary, they still wanted to cull the seals. And I got really confused both times. Every time it happened, because you kind of feel like you're following the textbook of conservation, which is you've done the research, you've got the evidence, you've even gone as far as to interact with the local communities and engage with them. Stakeholder engagement is a huge buzzword in conservation. And, you know, even then it doesn't work. And I feel like this is the stage that a lot of conservationists get to. So this was me in 2013, very young, very confused, didn't really know what to do. And I kind of looked into conflicts a little bit more. And as I said, the kind of way that we typically approach them is to concentrate on the impacts that humans are having on wildlife and nature. So things like retaliatory killing, people killing animals for damaging their crops, for example, or taking livestock. Or we look at the impacts on human lives and livelihoods. So again, that kind of, you know, damage to property, injury to humans, or, you know, even human well-being, so trauma, things like that. And it's very surface level, of a better word. So it's kind of looking at the problem in a very simplistic sense, very black and white. But this, you know, when I first started kind of in the world of conflicts, this was basically the dominant discourse on what conflicts were. But then as I got further into the literature, and I started to look at other fields, really, so kind of look at conflict peace studies and look at social sciences and look at political sciences, and I found this huge wealth of information that kind of explained the phenomenon that I was experiencing. So I prefer to describe conflicts now as more of an iceberg. So on the surface, you've got this kind of very surface level dispute over species impact or over kind of clashing interests between agriculture and conservation, for example. But then what a lot of people in conservation don't really talk about or don't see is these more hidden dimensions. So things like clashing cultures, things like power relations, governance mechanisms, relationships, trust, different value systems, different belief systems. And these are what you call your underlying drivers. So if you imagine conflict as kind of conservation, is sort of like the Titanic. When they're heading towards this iceberg, they can see the little bit at the top and, you know, you can try and navigate that, but it's actually all the hidden stuff underneath that sinks the ship in the end. And all this stuff that at the bottom of the iceberg, this isn't really anything to do with ecology or economics. This is more to do with our own species and understanding our own species. And so you kind of really, really need interdisciplinary approaches to really fully understand conservation and conflicts in their entirety. So that's fields that really understand us and how we interact with each other. So that's fields like the social sciences, political sciences, psychology, anthropology. And so then into a PhD. And I decided I was going to study a conservation conflict in Scotland that's quite contentious, shall we say, which is between grouse shooting and raptor conservation or birds of prey. So that's things like eagles. And to describe it very, very quickly, birds of prey basically they predate on a small flightless, not a flightless bird, but it's kind of like a glorified chicken, really. It's called a grouse, a red grouse. And in Scotland, there's a recreational sport where predominantly rich and wealthy people go out and shoot grouse. And obviously, because birds of prey take the grouse, then that means that the people that want to shoot the grouse aren't very happy about it. So they illegally kill birds of prey. So that's the conflict in a nutshell. But no one at the time is really trying to get in depth and really understand what was going on. There's a lot of stakeholders involved. There's a lot of politics going on. And so that was basically my PhD, was trying to figure out, is it just about the birds or is it about something else? So I kind of employed social science methodology to understand a conservation problem. So I use methods like discourse analysis, policy analysis, ethnographic approaches, and kind of like semi-structured in-depth interviews. And I've said here that these methods were informed by the situation and the participants themselves, because when I first started this, a lot of us have said you kind of feel really out of your depth when you first start as an interdisciplinary researcher, and I definitely did. So I immediately walked up to, gamekeepers' doors and knocked on their doors and asked if I could ask them about birds of prey, killing birds of prey, which is an illegal crime. And understandably, they all slammed the doors in my face. So I had to go right back to the drawing board. And so the reason for doing the ethnographical approach, that's sort of what people do in sensitive situations where they sort of want to get a feel for what's going on, but they don't want to be too intrusive. I did 2 years basically of building trust with stakeholders, and kind of really building relationships so that they trusted me enough to do an in-depth interview about this kind of very serious subject matter. And so I kind of did it out of necessity rather than, or it kind of came naturally rather than me deciding that that's the methodological route that I was going to go down. And then in 2008, I graduated from my PhD. Surprisingly, when you have a doctorate, they don't actually tell you how to wear the fancy hat. So you end up looking like a complete idiot in the pictures. So there's a bit of advice, make sure you know wear the hat. And I was really fortunate in that I kind of got a job straight away. So WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, and Luke Hoffman Institute were looking for somebody with my expertise to write kind of a report on human wildlife conflicts. And it was all about all the stuff I've just talked about, which was the importance of being interdisciplinary, all the problems that conservationists aren't currently looking at when it comes to human wildlife conflicts across the globe. And then after I'd finished that, I then joined the team at Stirling under the Conf project, which is based in the natural sciences faculty. It's led by Nils Bunnefeld, but it's very, very much an interdisciplinary team. So it's based, he brought me on basically to go very in-depth into some of the case studies that they were looking at and bring on that social and political science angle. And so now I kind of specialize in environmental governance across scales, patterns of conflict escalation and de-escalation, political ecology and global trends and all these different things. So kind of very far removed from where I began, standing on a boat and watching whales. So quite quickly, I'm a bit aware of the time, but I wanted to talk through some of the challenges of being an interdisciplinary researcher first off. A lot of these are very similar to what other people have touched on already. But obviously one of the biggest challenges is balancing these multiple fields. So a lot of them are extremely different in how they approach research and how they structure scientific papers and how they talk about journals. So say, for example, ecology is very, very focused on having a hypothesis, and then you answer that hypothesis and you have a very sort of strict structure, whereas social sciences are a bit more open-ended. They're about more having a research question, sort of being a bit more kind of open-ended in your methods and having a smaller sample size and things like that. And I found this really challenging, especially as my 3 supervisors were situated in these different fields. So it was really hard to actually try and figure out what my path forwards was within that. Also, this has already been mentioned, but feeling like you're a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none, and not quite really sort of sitting on the boundaries of a lot of these different disciplines. I also feel because of that sometimes I have to defend my science. So what I mean by that is when I'm trying to present my science at very conservation orientated conferences, I feel like I have to defend myself against being seen as too wishy-washy. But then in the other way around, when I go and present at a social science conference, I feel very, very out of my depth and feel like I'm going to have my methods pulled apart. Also, there's often a lack of support for interdisciplinary researchers, so a lack of training or access to resources. And the same goes for funding. So a lot of funding opportunities are very set to one discipline or the other. So one good example is I recently did a couple of sandpits for the British Academy. And the British Academy originally weren't going to have me because I was situated in a natural sciences faculty, even though my research is very, very much social science. Again, you don't fit into that kind of faculty box. And you're also part of a very small pool. So people with your kind of skill set are very few and far between, because not everybody has that sort of mix, the same mix of disciplines that you do. And that makes it very challenging for things like trying to find a reviewer for your paper, for example, that you haven't already worked with or you don't already know. That's one thing that I've really struggled with. But then again, I've talked about the challenges, but I also want to talk about the good stuff as well. So again, being part of a small pool isn't, exactly a wholly negative thing, because it does mean that you have a very unique skill set that a lot of people really, really like and really want, and also that they really need. So I found that a lot of teams are often looking for a gap to fill that I can, or have a gap that I can fill. And it's also really cool to find your own very individual niche. So for me, for example, I knew that I wanted to work in conservation, but I also knew that my skill set was in interacting with people and working with people. So I finally found the sweet spot where those two things mix. It's also really great to be able to broaden your horizons and look outside the box a little bit. So science is all about problem solving. And I think that interdisciplinary research really lends itself to that kind of problem solving aspect. There's lots of new and exciting opportunities. A diverse skill set that matches up more than people think. So, conservation, for example, we're working with humans all the time. So the majority of it is actually interacting with people. So to have kind of like social science training, to have facilitation training is really, really useful. And lastly, we very, very much we live in a very complex world, and there's a lot of huge global problems that you really need an interdisciplinary approach for. So it's really brilliant to actually be part of that. And just very, very quickly, I just kind of wanted to mention a few things that I found that help navigate some of these challenges. So the obvious one is to get a good team. So a team that is not only open-minded, but also really, really supportive of the work that you do. So Comfy Bio, I found, has been an amazing environment for that. Everybody's really open-minded. Nils in particular is very, very supportive and good at pushing us to kind of think outside the box a little bit. And that also goes for having mentors who are there to help you out. So I mentioned my PhD supervisory team. One was a social scientist, one was a political scientist, and one was an ecologist. So they all kind of helped me out in those different areas of expertise. And I did find I was a little bit nervous at first to sort of put myself out there to join workshops and training in other fields. So say, for example, to actually go to training run by the Social Science Research Association, for example, because I was afraid I'd be well out of my depth, but they were actually incredibly valuable. So please don't be afraid to do that. This might be a bit controversial, but sometimes it's hard to find funding for interdisciplinary projects, and the funder has a very, very specific idea of what they want. But I found that sometimes you can almost tailor your proposal to the funder and then kind of later on develop it a little bit more and sort of go down the avenues that you want to go down to a certain degree, and to kind of focus on the problem rather than being boxed in by a certain discipline. So a lot of these problems need, as I mentioned earlier, need approaches from multiple fields. And lastly, just, have confidence in yourself and the unique skill set that you've developed from working in all these different fields. I think that's really, really important. But yes, so I'm very conscious of the time, so I'm going to end it there. But if you want to ask me any questions, you can at the end, or there's my Twitter or my email. I'm always happy for people to be in touch if they need any help or anything like that.
Thank you so much, Isla. We will get straight on to Izzy's presentation now. So finally, we've got Dr. Izzy Jones, who's interested in finding new, positive ways to tackle global and local challenges involving people and biodiversity as we pursue sustainable development, biodiversity conservation, and action on climate change. So I will hand over to you, Izzy.
All right, thanks very much, Wendy. Can everyone see that okay? I'm guessing so.
Yep.
Perfect. Well, it was really lucky, actually. going last because Isla set this up perfectly when she was talking about using interdisciplinary approaches to tackle global problems. And I guess what I want to talk to you about today is what gets me up in the morning, which is trying to do just that, think about global challenges that we need to solve. And my current work as a research fellow at the University of Stirling, I'm in biological and environmental sciences, tries to think about how we can achieve our sustainable development goals and do that in a novel way by combining biodiversity and energy justice to resolve conflicts. And already in that title, you'll probably get an inkling of the different disciplines that are going to be coming through in this piece of work. So the United Nations have set 17 sustainable development goals, which we need to reach by 2030. And the key thing about these goals is that they're all interconnected. And so they involve people, the environment, the economy, all sorts of things. But when we read something like that, them being interconnected, it immediately kind of triggers an alarm bell almost, because often when things are connected like that, it means that we might not be able to achieve all of them without, or we'll be able to achieve one, but we can't achieve another. So that scenario leads to certain trade-offs, and they can be damaging to both people and the environment. They can cause conflicts. And this is what I'm going to try and get at in my fellowship. And I'm going to run you through an example of this sort of conflict scenario in terms of sustainable development goals. So my work is focusing on hydropower development. And so when we build mega dams for energy generation, we can start to hit targets for affordable and renewable energy, and also for the development of infrastructure and industry in countries. But when we stick a barrier onto a river, we can cause sort of immediate and also very long-term and very spatially extensive impacts to biodiversity, whether it's on the land. So obviously, if you create a reservoir, you can flood vast areas of terrestrial habitat. But because you're also disrupting the natural flow of a river, you can, for example, prevent migratory species moving up and down those rivers. And you can change flood pulses and all sorts of things like that. So that really can affect quite a lot of terrestrial and aquatic biodiversity. And of course, there are many people in our beautiful world that rely on healthy and functioning ecosystems. You know, we all do, but river-dependent communities and people in particular can be hugely reliant on rivers and forests for subsistence and livelihoods. So when we affect ecosystems through infrastructure projects, we affect a lot of people as well. And then finally, the decisions to create or to construct dams often don't involve everybody. So often the people, river-dependent people, are not included in these decisions, and those decisions are made very high up. So it's a national level, sometimes international. Lots of big companies. You've probably heard lots about the huge amounts of money that flows around when large hydropower projects are underway. So Belo Monte is a good example in Brazil. Lots of money has gone into that, but the impacts have been absolutely huge. And this is not, this is a global issue. So we've got more than 58,000 large dams. So that's anything above 15 meters in height that are operating globally, and nearly 10,000 of these dams are for hydropower. And they've been constructed or are planned for construction in all our major habitat types. 50% of our large river systems have dams on them. And it's been estimated that between 40 and 80 million people have been permanently displaced already. So this is a big global challenge that involves lots of different sustainable development goals that we need to try and get our heads around. And so what my work seeks to do is to understand what these global sustainable development policies look like at the local level, also at the national level, and vice versa, how those all interact to impact and affect the sort of global state of things, because as a globally, we all rely on healthy and functioning ecosystems and thriving communities. So these have, impacts to those sustainable development goals, and conflicts between them can really have profound ramifications for all of us. So that's what I'm hoping to do in this project. But how did I get here? So I did my PhD in tropical forest ecology. So I'm an ecologist by training, like Isla, but I worked in a landscape that had been impacted by hydropower development in Brazil. So the image here, I don't know what, hopefully you can see. All those tiny little grey matchsticks, those are trees that have been flooded by the Balbina Reservoir. So they're all dead now. And it's left these islands that are former hilltops. So there's been a lot of work done on the sort of long-term kind of meltdown of ecological communities that have been left on these islands. And whilst I was spending months and months in these forests, kind of being surrounded by, pretty major biodiversity impacts from dam construction, I guess I started to, things started to tick over in my mind about, these, the tensions between conservation, but also the need to generate energy, and particularly in developing countries. But I was still very much an ecologist. So this was my bread and butter, going out into challenging environments, preferably counting things. So in my case, trees, counted a lot of trees, like 11,000 of them for my PhD. Getting to hang out in the rainforest with, well, you can see in the bottom right picture, that's my feet. And then next to it are the massive jaguar paw prints, which were right next to my hammock. So this was my bread and butter, and this is, field ecologist through and through. But after my PhD, as several other people have mentioned, it was very much, okay, so where's the next job going to be? And I was hugely lucky to get a position working in conservation conflict. So it's in the same group as Isla was talking about. And this was my first experience of working with people. And it's really crucial because decisions are made by people. So if we want to sort of understand why people are deciding to do the things that they do, build dams, for example, it's really important to understand how people make those decisions. So that was starting to bring in this, bring in the social sciences and this idea of, the social and ecological links. And I guess those two major sort of life experiences were how I arrived at my current work, which, as I was saying, combines biodiversity, so still got my field ecology hat on there, but with new areas to me. So energy justice, as Jen was mentioning, and lucky me, I get to work with Jen while I'm doing this project to resolve conflicts. So again, lucky me, get to still work with Isla on conservation conflicts, but it's centered on the idea of finding ways to pursue sustainable development in a truly sustainable way where people and the environment don't lose out. So that's the plan for the next few years anyway. But how did I even get there? So this is the bit before the PhD, and the reason why I bring this in is because I think it's really important for understanding my particular pathway, and I guess I wanted to just highlight the fact that if anyone out there is sort of thinking, maybe I don't want to be in academia and I'll just head out a little bit and then I'll come back in, maybe this is an example of someone else who did that. So I did my undergraduate ages ago now down at Plymouth. Funnily enough, I started out doing marine biology, but then I changed to environmental biology because I realised that I'd never probably wouldn't get back to a rainforest if I carried down the marine route. So I did that, and then afterwards I left. I needed a bit of a break from academia, and I also was sort of had this vision of doing science, but in really difficult places. So that's why I trained as an outdoors instructor to get more formal training in that kind of thing. And my vision was that one day the science and sort of that expedition life would come together. And I guess it did in my PhD, really. So tried lots of different things. I ran around chasing frogs in the jungle, butterflies in the UK, all of this kind of stuff to try and understand what exactly I wanted to do with myself. But I then realised I needed a bit more formal scientific training, so I did an MRes, and again that took me to some brilliant places for my work there. I went to Uzbekistan and did some work on oil and gas infrastructure development and how that impacts plant communities in a semi-arid desert environment, which was super cool. Because again, difficult environment plus science, brilliant. And I also started to try and get a bit more experience of policy and how science can inform policies. I guess even then maybe I was interested in how people make decisions and make policies. I didn't know what that kind of looked like back then. So just to kind of finish off with really is to highlight that slightly wiggly career paths can be super useful for when you're working across disciplines, because I think the richer your own personal experience is, whatever form that takes, really helps you understand other people's perspectives. So like Isla was saying, when trying to understand why people illegally hunt, for example, I think, if you've sort of had a lot of weird and wonderful experiences, somehow that kind of helps take you out of your comfort zone and helps you understand a little bit more and see lots of different perspectives for what's going on. Anyway, I will leave it there because I want to save some time for questions. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, Izzy. That was wonderful. So we have 15 minutes now for questions.